They called her the NC. In 1918, she was the largest flying boat ever built. The Navy's great hope in its long-range war against German U-boats and submarine pens. But World War I ended before the NCs could be tested in combat. So now, less than 6 months since the armistice, the Navy prepares for a peacetime test of the NCs and their crews. An adventure that begins a new era in naval aviation. Commanding the NC-4, A.C. Reed.
This is a diagram of the flight of the NC-4 across the Atlantic Ocean, the first time of any aircraft to fly across the ocean. There were 4 planes originally scheduled to go. One of them had a partial wreck, so that only 3 actually started. The start was made from Rockaway Beach, Long Island, on the 8th of May, 1919. We went to Halifax, Nova Scotia, the NC-4 being about 2 or 3 days behind the NC-1 and NC-3 on account of an accident. From Halifax to Trepasy Bay, we all assembled and started out on the 16th of May on a late afternoon for the flight to the Azores. This part of the flight was at night. The rest of it was in the daytime, during which we ran across a bad storm. However, the NC-4 managed to get into Horta Fayal. The NC-1 and 3 both landed in order to find out where they were, because they were lost. The water was so rough they couldn't get off, and they both started to break up. From Ponta Delgada to Lisbon was a very short flight, about 10 hours, possibly a little less. Then the next event was the landing at Lisbon. The people there were very glad to see us. However, not half as glad as we were to see them.
Naval aviation would be frequently in the news throughout the next 10 years. There would be other firsts, other records, new names in the Aviation Hall of Fame, as the Navy worked to prove that the airplane operating with the fleet could become a powerful naval weapon. But in the 1920s, some doubted that aviation would ever develop into more than a reconnaissance tool. Others felt that the bomber had made navies obsolete. Recalling the controversy centering around the bombing tests of the early 20s is Admiral Alfred Johnson.
The Navy had long wanted to carry out bombing tests against naval vessels, but was hampered because of a lack of adequate targets. Fortunately, at the end of the First World War, when Germany surrendered its ships, they were apportioned among the Allied naval powers. When the ships arrived, it formed a naval task force composed of Navy aircraft and Marine planes, and I was put in charge. The Navy invited the Army to take part in the tests, feeling that we all had a lot to learn about bombing ships and that all of our pilots should get experience in that work. The plan called for bombing one ship of each type, submarine, destroyer, cruiser, and battleship. And to attack all the ships, first with small bombs and then work up gradually to bigger and bigger bombs. To inspect the ships after each attack and to have the Navy, Army, and Marine Corps planes alternate in the attacks. The big event, of course, was the bombing of the battleship Ostfriesland. There had been an awful lot of talk about it and a good deal of betting, and everybody wanted to see the show. The naval transport Henderson brought down a shipload of very important people to look at the show, and it included all the cabinet members, the foreign ambassadors, congressmen, naval attachés, military attachés, and a load of newspaper men. The first attack was by the Marines, and that was followed by the Navy and then the Army. Each plane dropping so many bombs and the targets being inspected by them. Of course, all of the aviators, Marines, Army, and Navy, were itching to get in on the kill. But they had to take their turns. It was Bartlett's turn to attack with a squadron of Navy Martin bombers armed with 2,000-pound bombs. While he was rearming his planes, I received a message from Langley Field. It was from General Mitchell, Billy Mitchell, who commanded the Army planes that took part in the tests. He asked permission to take off and attack the target. I radioed back to him that I would give him the exact time when to take off. Just a few minutes later, I got another message from Mitchell saying that his planes had taken off and were on the way to the target and would bomb the target on arrival. Please not to let any Navy planes interfere. He arrived at the target before Bartlett's planes and dropped 7 2,000-pound bombs, which of course meant the end of the Ostfriesen. We watched the big ship sink. It was an impressive sight, and it must have impressed the people on the Henderson greatly, because next morning the newspapers carried big accounts of the whole thing and created the impression throughout the country that aviation had made navies obsolete.
Convinced that the United States Navy would be obsolete without aviation, a determined group of naval officers under the leadership of Admiral William A. Moffett worked to prove that aviation must be an integral part of naval operations.
Admiral Moffett has generally been called the father of naval aviation, and I think very properly so, because he is probably responsible more than any other one man for our having a single Navy, a single weapon system, making use of aviation as an integral part of the Navy, if not its main striking power. That was Admiral Moffett's accomplishment. I first met him when I was stationed at Anacostia as a young pilot. I'd been there some months when he sent for me and appointed me as his aide. He was a very attractive, forceful, and energetic man with a tremendous power of persuasion. And being a very brainy man, he tied in persuasion with logic. So he was able to put his ideas across both to the public and to the Navy itself. He had been appointed as Director of Naval Aviation in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. He, I think, is largely responsible for setting up the Bureau of Aeronautics the way it was originally set up, as not only a materiel bureau, but also responsible for the operations of aircraft and for the development of tactics, and first, last and foremost, for personnel. It was a materiel bureau which handled aviation personnel. Now, in order to ensure that the young officers who formed the original group of aviators in the Navy should not feel lost and not be downgraded, it was essential to get people in to fly the airplanes as squadron commanders, as group commanders, and unit commanders with maturity and judgment and rank greater than that of the original group of youngsters. So Admiral Moffett personally recruited quite a number of relatively senior people, lieutenant commanders and commanders, to form the leadership of naval aviation as a part of the Navy. Those are the men who proved the value of Admiral Moffett's vision of the Navy as a single weapons system.
Facing Admiral Moffett was also the fundamental problem of taking aviation to sea. Over the 1920s, determined efforts were made to give aviation the mobility of the Navy ships and a prominent place in fleet operations. Inherited from World War I was a highly developed flying boat program. Starting with the F-5L, the Navy continued development of flying boats, and by the end of the 20s had proved their value in long-range reconnaissance and horizontal bombing. Seaplane tenders were also designed to give mobility to flying boats operating with the fleet. Also promising for fleet reconnaissance was lighter-than-air aviation. The Navy's first airship was the Shenandoah, built in the United States from data obtained from the analysis of a captured German Zeppelin. A second dirigible, the Los Angeles, was built in Germany as reparations and delivered to the Navy in 1922. Los Angeles and Shenandoah were operated by the Navy as flying laboratories in an effort to learn how rigid airships could best serve the fleet. Recalling these early efforts to take lighter than air to sea is Vice Admiral C.E. Rosendahl.
Since the ships were intended as rigid airship fleet scouts, we wanted to develop everything we could to facilitate our operations with the fleet. So one of the ideas was to put a mooring mast on a ship. In other words, provide a floating servicing base. So we were fortunate in getting the tanker Patoka assigned to that duty, and a mooring mast was erected. We developed the mooring technique and used it with considerable success. However, we soon saw that it was a smooth water operation and did not have as much versatility as we had hoped. We did also want to try to land and service from the flush deck carriers. In those days we had the Lexington and the Saratoga. It took us a lot of doing to get permission to use one of them, and we finally got permission to try a landing on the deck of the Saratoga one cold, blustery winter day, just as she was heading for the Pacific coast. At one point, we were driven down by a rather sharp gust, and the only way we had of checking that downward motion was, of course, by dropping ballast. So it was my unpleasant duty to have to drop a considerable amount of water on the top side there, which of course got some of the ground through. But it did check our descent.
Mooring masts were also constructed ashore, and Americans throughout the country were able to see for the first time the Navy's ships of the sky. On one of these flights, the Shenandoah encountered a severe line squall over Ohio and was lost. Lieutenant Rosendahl was the airship's senior surviving officer.
When the Shenandoah was lost in September 1925, there had been some other aircraft accidents of some consequence, and there was a considerable uproar in the country over the aeronautical policy in general. The result was that a Morrow board was set up which studied the whole aeronautical picture in great detail. And largely from that, we set up a 5-year aircraft building program, of which one part was the provision for 2 large rigid airships of about 6 million cubic feet capacity each to serve as adjuncts to the fleet. Those became the ZRS-4 and the ZRS-5, and in turn were named the Akron and the Macon. That was the beginning of our modern rigid airship program.
But could aviation go to sea with capital ships of the Navy? Shortly after the war, platforms were built on turrets in an effort to adapt land planes to cruisers and battleships. The techniques of launch and recovery required many hours of experiment. By the late 20s, seaplanes were in wide service throughout the fleet. As scouts and spotters for naval gunfire, they quickly proved their value in gunnery exercises and fleet maneuvers. But battleships and cruisers could carry only a few planes. Recovery at sea was difficult. What the Navy needed was a ship exclusively designed for air operations, an airplane carrier that could move with the fleet. The British had developed such a ship during World War I. American observers were impressed, and in 1919, the Collier Jupiter was converted to give the Navy its first aircraft carrier, Langley.
So this is the photograph of the Langley when she was finally, as she was when she's finally converted. The conversion was authorized in 1919, but she wasn't commissioned until 1922. The ship was stripped down to its main deck, and then this superstructure put in there, built in like a railroad bridge. We had many things we had to work out. Since she was an experimental carrier, the forerunner of the Saratoga and Lexington, many, many things. There's not only the resting gear, there's the catapults, it was the firefighting, the handling of gasoline, the operational features of the hangar deck and the flight deck, and including even the organization of the air department. One of my jobs was to design the hook, the trailing hook that engaged the wires that was attached to the airplane. We had a very vague idea of what the stresses actually were on the airplane, if they were important to have in order to design the hook and its attachments, and also to know the distribution of the weights in the hull. So I borrowed from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics an accelerometer. It was the only one in existence. It was their pride and joy. And I faithfully promised that I'd take good care of it and return it to them as soon as possible. Well, I installed this accelerometer in a VE7 on a shock-absorbing mount. The film that made the record, the accelerometer, was only good for 30 seconds. So it had to be turned on just as the airplane was coming over the ramp and the pilot was concentrating on making a precision landing. And time after time, the pilots would forget to turn the switch on. So one day I said, let me get in that airplane. I'll forget to turn it on. So I got in this VE7 and circled around and came in for my landing. Just as I came over the ramp, I put my head in the cockpit to turn the switch on. But I must have unconsciously pushed the stick forward, because when I put my head out of that cockpit, that deck was coming up me 100 miles an hour. I was too low and too fast. I pulled back, but it was too late. My hook engaged the cross wire, but my axle hooks didn't engage the 4.5 wires. I had the dubious distinction of being the first man to go overboard on any of our aircraft carriers. And I got out, and he finally salvaged the airplane. But the only thing missing in the airplane was the accelerometer. It was the most embarrassing instance that I remember in my whole career, because I designed the hook that broke. I was flying the airplane that broke the hook, and I crashed an airplane, and I lost the NACA's accelerometer.
Admiral Pennoyer might have been the first to go over the side seeking an answer to a problem, but he was certainly not the last. Each flight was an experiment, an essential part of developing and perfecting the aircraft carrier and its planes.
Flying the airplanes on or off the carrier deck seemed quite an experience to us in those days, partly because of the rather low-power Hispano-Suizer engine and wooden propeller with which the airplane was equipped, and partly because of the configuration of the airplane itself. I remember we had to put 2 or 3 cushions into the cockpit seat in order to sit high enough to see over the rather sizable radiator which the liquid-cooled engine installation required. Also, the engine was rather sensitive to temperature changes, and whenever you varied the throttle up or down, you had also to vary the radiator shutters, which were manually operated. You felt a little like an organ player as you came in for a landing, perched up on those cushions. One hand on the control column and one hand playing a tune, first on the throttle and then on the radiator shutters and then on the hook release and then back to the throttle and other odds and ends, so that all this time while you were making an approach with your wheels only a few feet above the water. What the Navy needed for this situation was a whole new deal in airplane and engine design, something which would make full use of the opportunities which the aircraft carrier offered, and yet be capable of the short takeoffs and landings required, and rugged enough to stand the beating of day-by-day operations into the arresting gear and by catapult shots. A new type power plant was also a key element in this program.
The air-cooled engine provided a much-needed breakthrough in carrier aviation. Lightweight, compact, efficient, and reliable. Engines like the famed Wasp brought forth a new generation of carrier aircraft. For these new planes, new aircraft carriers, Saratoga and Lexington, built on the hulls of battle cruisers laid down during World War I. Their mission was to follow the fleet and provide long-range scouting and support of the battleships and cruisers. It remained for naval aviation to prove that an airplane operating with the fleet could itself be a powerful weapon. Time-honored naval weapons were mated to carrier aircraft. Techniques for delivery were perfected. Especially promising was the new technique of dive bombing. In 1927, dive bombing doctrines were first used in combat in support of Marines at surrounded Acatal, Nicaragua. On operations in Haiti, Nicaragua, China, marine aviation developed into an effective arm of the Fleet Marine Force. With the perfection of weapons and techniques to extend naval air power to the enemy, came an event in 1929 that was to profoundly affect the future of carrier aviation.
In the spring of 1929, the entire West Coast fleet went south to the Panama area. It was really an annual set of war games, this time primarily to demonstrate the effectiveness of the new carriers, then new carriers, and the new technique of dive bombing. At that time, I was in command of BB-2, which is really a fighter squadron, also equipped to carry bombs. For this war game exercise, the fleet was divided in 2 parts. Admiral Reeves had command of the attacking force with the Saratoga and all its accompanying ships. Admiral Reeves was a very cagey man. He decided for the purpose of this exercise to go far south in a huge semicircle to avoid early detection and planned to arrive within striking range of the Panama locks before dawn. The evening before the attack, Admiral Reeves sent for me. He said he was becoming concerned lest he might have been detected by surface vessels during the night, and he wanted to make sure of getting at least one attack through.
he proposed to launch me and my squadron at 2 a.m. He asked if I could do it. I said yes, just because I wanted to do the job, even though this would be the first time any full squadron had ever been launched from far at sea during the night. Everything went beautifully. We arrived over the locks just before dawn. It was still dark on the ground. We launched a perfectly wonderful dive bombing attack, split attack, and nobody on the ground had yet stirred. Then we climbed up and waited for the reaction from those on the ground, and finally the Army Air Corps appeared, and presently we were engaged in a squadron dogfight with a Navy plane on the tail of every Army plane. This really because at that time we had better performing planes. We arrived back at the carrier right on time and right where she belonged and where we belonged, landed everything safely. Admiral Reeves was so pleased he couldn't wait, but came running down to the flight deck to ask how things had gone. As for all of us, we all felt that this really had unveiled carrier aviation and the new technique of dive bombing, and this was certainly proved true in later years.
And thus, the weapon is developed. In contrast to the small fleet air detachments of 1919, the 1920s had seen naval aviation grow to a major naval weapon. By 1930, 3 aircraft carriers were in full operation. Patrol squadrons and seaplane tenders were performing essential scouting functions. Aircraft were regularly assigned to battleships and cruisers. A lighter-than-air program was in full swing. Together, these elements were playing an important part in the offensive and defensive maneuvers of the annual fleet war games. Technical progress was being made on all fronts as each year aircraft flew faster, higher, and longer. Tactics had been developed, and throughout the Navy, a growing appreciation of the potential power of aircraft was being translated into doctrine. Men were ready for command responsibility. Naval aviators who had tested and worked throughout the 20s to help solve the Navy's basic and unique problem of taking aviation to sea.